Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Howard Ehrlich. I'm the Dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences. And one of the humbling things about being a dean is just 2 minutes ago I was setting up chairs and back. You can understand that one goes from elevation to dissension, if that's a word. Welcome. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here on a wonderful occasion. And I'm going to say a brief word of welcome and turn the program over to Professor Claire Gleitman, who is chair of the English department in the School of Humanities and Sciences. I want to say a word about the Robert Ryan professorship. I did have the good fortune of spending some years when Bob was teaching in the history department, and as a dean I was afforded a very unusual opportunity. When Bob Ryan passed away, he left a substantial legacy in the form of money to the School of Humanities and Sciences, and our president, Peggy Williams, had the good sense, I think, and this is the surprising opportunity. Usually deans are not presented with unfettered money. And Peggy Williams said, we would like to entertain a proposal from you to make a recommendation on how to use Bob Ryan's legacy in a way that honors Bob, enhances the school. And finally, the recommendation I consulted with faculty colleagues was to establish the Robert Ryan professorship in the humanities. Bob was devoted to the humanities. He was devoted to interdisciplinary learning. He taught here in our history department for 42 years, an amazing record, really. And the folks with whom I consulted and was able to make a successful recommendation to the president and provost decided that honoring Bob through a named professorship, one that had a 3-year term, would be a wonderful legacy for Bob. And that really is what brings us together this afternoon. I'll mention one more thing that will be obvious once Kevin Murphy begins to speak, and that is that part of the legacy is enriching the intellectual community. And so a dimension of the Robert Ryan professorship, and one that I think also has a good deal of insight, is the requirement, the dimension from time to time for the Ryan professor to publicly enrich the intellectual environment of the school and college. And so that's what brings us here today, and it is really a privilege and a pleasure to be able to introduce the Ryan professor and this dimension of that professorship, which is a public presentation that we are all very much looking forward to, and which Professor Gleitman is going to more specifically introduce right now. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Kevin Murphy, the Robert Ryan Professor in the Humanities, as well as my colleague and my very dear friend. Kevin has been a faculty member at Ithaca College since 1979. He received tenure in 1984, and he was promoted to full professor in 1989. Kevin has also taught at Cornell University, the Université de Lille in France, and at Seoul National University in Korea. In addition to the Robert Ryan Professorship, Kevin has received numerous awards and honors from Ithaca College, including research grants, interdisciplinary grants, and a Dana Teaching Award. He's also the recipient of a Fulbright Lectureship in American Literature, and he's been a fellow at the Cornell Society for the Humanities. Kevin began his scholarly career with a focus on American literature. His dissertation was on Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, and he went on to publish important articles on Henry James and Mark Twain. In the early 90s, however, Kevin's scholarly emphasis shifted, a shift he traces back to his first visit to Ireland in 1975, where he found himself warmly embraced by a branch of his family that did not immigrate to America with his father and his uncle back in the 1920s. From that time on, Kevin has told me, my doom was sealed. In the years since, Ireland has been Kevin's passion, and he's written numerous articles on a variety of Irish writers, including but not limited to Seamus Heaney and W.B. Yeats. He's also participated 3 times in the Yeats International Summer School in Sligo, which is attended by some of the most important figures in Irish studies, and where, I'm told by Kevin, conversations about Irish literature continue long into the night, interlaced with much song and revelry. I imagine that Kevin, who sings a mean version of Love Potion No. 9, is a full and enthusiastic participant. Kevin is also a published poet whose work has appeared in many venues. I would warmly recommend to you his poem, Oatmeal Ad, October 1953, which you can find on his website. Finally, and by no means incidentally, Kevin is a much beloved teacher in our department, who offers courses ranging from Introduction to Poetry to a senior seminar on Joyce's Ulysses, a class that our most advanced English majors regard as the ultimate challenge to their literary muscles and one of the most memorable courses in the major. Indeed, one student wrote in an evaluation, "I will remember this class when I'm an old lady in my rocking chair." Another student, after taking Kevin's Introduction to Poetry, praises him for, quote, bringing poems to life by operating on but not killing the text. In sum, I call Kevin a model of the best Ithaca College has to offer because he combines a passionate love for his subject matter with an equally passionate dedication to teaching. I've seen Kevin teach, and I can testify. He teaches with joy. It's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Murphy, speaking tonight about the Irish political elegy, William Butler Yeats and Seamus Heaney.
Claire, thank you. Save that, please. Thanks for those kind words. And thanks to Cheryl Kramer for providing us with this lovely space. And Howard, thanks to you too, not just for those kind words of introduction, but also for your support for the Robert Ryan Fellowship and for the lovely reception that's to follow, if we can get through this. Before I turn to the talk, I'd like to call attention to some events that are happening right now in Northern Ireland. Just a few weeks ago, on March 26th, there was a photo on the front page of the New York Times that few people ever expected to see. I don't expect you to be able to see this, but there are people sitting at this table that had sworn that they would not sit next to one another. It's Ian Paisley, the head of the Democrat Unionist Party, and Gerry Adams, the head of Sinn Féin, were at the same table, and collectively they promised to bring a power-sharing unity government back into being on May 8th. This is a very fragile union, as was indicated by the shape of the table these two former enemies sat at. They had refused to sit next to one another, but they realized that if they sat opposite each other, it would present a kind of image of confrontation. So what they did was to sit at the adjacent ends of a diamond-shaped table so that they could at least affect an oblique angle of cooperation. There were no handshakes, and it remains very much to be seen if the unity government will succeed into coming into being on May 8th. 5 senior members of the Democrat Unionist Party have already resigned in protest, and yesterday a senior member of Sinn Féin resigned in protest as well. So What's clear, though, is that the only hope for an enduring peace in Northern Ireland rests with that power-sharing government. And so it's with that hope, or to that hope, that I dedicate this paper. My subject this afternoon is the Irish political elegy, and as a way of entering and illustrating this subject, I want to look at two specific poems written at different ends of the 20th century. The poems I have in mind are Easter 1916 by William Butler Yeats and Casualty by Seamus Heaney. Now, both poems are in the program that you've received, and I'll be reading and referring to those poems later in the talk. Yeats's poem is a response to the failed insurrection on the day after Easter 1916, an event which would, in hindsight, be celebrated as the birth of the emerging Irish nation. In terms of the more contemporary troubles of Northern Ireland that erupted in the late 1960s, Seamus Heaney's Casualty is a response to the events and aftermath of Bloody Sunday. That's January 3rd, 1972, when British paratroopers killed 13 unarmed protesters taking part in a civil rights demonstration. A 14th person would die in hospital months later. The events of that day, Bloody Sunday, have been the subject of two British inquiries, the second of which has yet to publish their findings, two movies, a British Brian Friel play, and a rock song, Sunday, Bloody Sunday, which Bono and U2 have performed over 600 times in concert around the world since its release. Each of the poems, then, is a poetic response to a significant act of political violence which affected Ireland as a whole. Each commemorates those killed in that act of violence and shapes that commemoration in an adaptation of the elegy, the traditional form of poetic lamentation. As such, both poems are political elegies, a poetic form which Irish poets have adapted and made particular use of during the past century. In addition, as is the case with traditional elegies both in English and in earlier literatures, each of these poems becomes the occasion for the poet to reconsider the nature and purpose of his vocation. As such, these poems are simultaneously public and private, political and poetic, national and personal. Before turning to the poems themselves, then, I'd like to provide some political and personal context which surrounds them. In the case of the Yeats poem, we should be aware that Ireland in 1916 was in a state of constant political turmoil. There were, for example, 5 separate standing armies, each with its own agenda and leadership. There was the British Army, which was in the midst of World War I, and Ireland was still very much part of the British Empire. England had passed a Home Rule Bill, which was to have become law in 1914, and which would have granted Ireland limited self-governance, a kind of dominion status within the British Commonwealth. But with the outbreak of World War I, this bill had been suspended until the end of hostilities. In active opposition to the possibility of Home Rule, which was fiercely opposed in the north of Ireland, the mostly Protestant Irish of the north formed a second army, the Ulster Volunteers, with the express purpose of resisting with military force any separation from England. In response to that action, the mostly Catholic nationalists in the south formed a third army, the Irish Volunteers, with the express purpose of enforcing Home Rule by military force if necessary. In addition, there had been a major general strike in Dublin in 1913, and in reaction to the brutal tactics that had been employed by the Dublin Metropolitan Police to suppress the workers, the strikers had formed a fourth army, the Citizens' Army, to protect and support the destitute workers. Finally, there was also a fifth and secret army of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was dedicated to overthrowing British rule of Ireland by any means necessary. This secret army was embedded within the army of the Irish Volunteers, and this group, whom the historian Roy Foster has called a minority of a minority, would be the ones who led the insurrection against British rule in 1916. The overwhelming majority of the Irish population in 1916 supported England in the global conflict, but for differing reasons. In the north, 60,000 of the Ulster Volunteers had joined the British Army in the hopes of assuring England's support for continued union with Great Britain. In the south, 90,000 of the Irish Volunteers had also joined the British Army with a parallel but opposite hope that Home Rule would be implemented as soon as the war ended. Thus, when the Irish Republican Brotherhood, made up of approximately 1,500 rebels, along with about 300 members of the Citizen Army, took over key points in the capital of Dublin on April 24th, they were, for the most part, not supported by the populace, especially as the British Army systematically shelled downtown Dublin to rubble over the next 5 days. After their surrender on April 29th, crowds of Dubliners jeered the rebels as they were being led off to jail. But in what was surely one of the catastrophic blunders in the history of English military strategy and diplomacy, the British Army, after summary courts-martial, began to execute the leaders of the insurrection by firing squad. As words of the trial and summary executions carried out between May 3rd and 12th passed around Dublin, the mood of the capital and the country changed dramatically. In terms of the speed with which the leaders were executed, one observer dryly noted that the only way the British could have made the appeals period shorter was by shooting the prisoners in the courtroom. What made the executions even more sensational were the circumstances that surrounded the deaths of a number of the leaders. Patrick Pearse, the school teacher who had led the rising, had written a poem and letter to his mother from his death cell, the publication of which transformed him almost immediately from an outlaw to a national martyr. Joseph Mary Plunkett, the 28-year-old poet, married his fiancée, Grace Gifford, in his cell 2 hours before his execution, and they were allowed 10 minutes alone. James Connolly, the labor leader turned insurrectionist, had been wounded in the shoulder and leg in the retaking of the General Post Office. His ankle had been shattered, and he was therefore carried to the firing squad grounds strapped to a chair. He is to have said, "You can shoot me if you like, but I'm dying for my country." In terms of Yeats's personal context up to this point in 1916, he was very much an Irish nationalist, even though he had been born into an Anglo-Irish Protestant family. He, however, had been for most of his life opposed to military or violent resistance to the British. Instead, he urged a kind of literary nationalism which would free the Irish intellectually and culturally from the British. Almost from the outset of his career, he saw his vocation self-consciously very much in terms of this Irish nationalism. As he says at the opening of his 1892 poem, he would be 28 years old at this point, To Ireland in the Coming Times, says, "Know that I would accompanied be true brother of a company that sang to sweeten Ireland's wrong, ballad and story, ran and song." In the early part of his career, he immersed himself in the folklore and early epics of Ireland and devoted himself to creating what he called the Celtic twilight in his poems and stories. He turned his attention to the theater for the same reason in the 1890s, and with Lady Augusta Gregory and John Millington Synge, founded the Abbey Theatre for the purpose of advancing this cultural nationalism. Deeply involved in both the poetry and the drama of this period was the love of Yeats's life, a woman named Maud Gonne. He met her in 1889. He was 23 and she was 22 at the time, and he would unsuccessfully court her for the next 28 years. He said accurately in his memoirs, "There the troubling of my life began." As it happens, Maud Gonne was a nationalist very much in favor of armed resistance to British rule of Ireland. His attraction to Gonne led Yeats to join in briefly with a number of advanced nationalist organizations, that is to say, organizations committed to violent resistance to English rule. But even then, he was more intimidated and repulsed by the action of mobs, as he saw them. She, on the other hand, was enthralled, both by the violent resistance she incited and the independence she urged these groups to usher in. Yeats proposed to her a number of times, which she turned down. Her explanation was that she had a dread of physical love, and she proposed that they have a spiritual relation, like brother and sister. So in 1903, when Maud Gonne married John McBride, an advanced nationalist who had fought against the British in the Boer War, Yeats was devastated. And in fact, he stopped writing poetry for almost 7 years. In the years leading up to the Easter Rising, a number of events coalesced to place Yeats in an adversarial relationship with the nationalists, and specifically the Catholic nationalists, who would lead the insurrection. For one thing, Maud Gonne's marriage to John McBride was short-lived. In 1906, she separated from McBride, accusing him of seducing her half-sister and molesting her daughter Iseult, who was then 11. The scandal was very public, and the Catholic nationalists in Dublin, for the most part, sided with McBride in the proceedings. Yeats, out of devotion to Maud, felt a deep antipathy to them as a group. In 1909, the Catholic organization Sinn Féin organized the riots which attended the opening of John Milton Synge's The Playboy of the Western World, and Yeats, consequently, felt a further resentment toward the Catholic nationalists as a group. When the Dublin Corporation, led by some powerful Catholic nationalists, refused to provide a municipal gallery to house a group of paintings with that provision were to be donated to Ireland, Yeats decided the entire class were Philistines. He expressed the disdain and contempt he felt in the poem September 1913, which remains one of the great polemical diatribes of Irish poetry. As far as Yeats was concerned, these nationalists were a bunch of money grubbers and religious bigots, incapable of transcending their mercantile views of culture and religion. As he says in the refrain to that poem, "Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave." At the moment of the Easter Rebellion, Yeats was not even in Ireland. He was in Gloucester, England, and he told the people he was with that he thought the leaders had died for an abstraction. Even so, he wrote to Lady Gregory on May 11th, in the midst of the executions, "I had no idea that any public event would ever so deeply move me, and I'm despondent about the future. At the moment, I feel all the work of years has been overturned, all the bringing together of classes, all the freeing of Irish literature and criticism from politics." When he heard of John McBride's death, he had been executed on May 5th, he went to Normandy to be with Maud Gonne and her daughter, and it was there he began Easter 1916. He finished it at Lady Gregory's estate of Coole Park and dated the manuscript, it's only one of 7 poems he's dated, September 25th, 1916. And if you want, I'm afraid the lighting's not very good, but I'm going to read the poem now so you can follow in the program. Easter 1916. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among gray 18th century houses. I've passed with a nod of the head or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn, all changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers, when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who were near my heart. Yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonough and McBride and Conley and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. As is the case with Yeats, each time he employs a traditional mode of poetry, he both absorbs and transforms the genre. In this case, he diverges from the traditional elegy in a number of ways. He writes his poem not for an individual, but for a group of people, a group which had not, up until the momentous event being commemorated, distinguished itself in any extraordinary way. Even more, it seems at various points in the poem that the heroism being praised is something that happened to the participants rather than a condition which they brought into being. The initial stanza of the poem, if anything, insists on the pedestrian nature of those being elegized. Those he picks out from that group to detail in the second stanza are described in cautious or outright negative terms. The description of Con Markowitz, for example, with its reference to her shrill voice and ignorant goodwill, has been aptly termed a studied insult. The reference to John McBride as a drunken, vainglorious lout may be understood biographically as Yeats's contempt for McBride's marital abuse of Maud Gonne, but it seems very much out of place in a poetic form traditionally devoted to apotheosis. Even the reference to Patrick Pearse riding our winged horse reduces Pearse's poetry to the level of cliché, and Pearse's helper and friend, Thomas MacDonough, is only coming into his force. In the poem, his potential for fame remains exactly that, potential rather than accomplishment. The real subject of the poem, of course, is transformation, one that changes utterly these ordinary, unattractive people into extraordinary heroes who will, by dint of this poem, stand outside of the minute-by-minute time-bound change that's such a fundamental part of the natural venue described in the third stanza. In this section, the political and the pastoral, the time-bound and the transcendental are placed in paradoxical tension. From one perspective, the single-mindedness of these mortals has been enchanted to a stone in the midst of the flowing sexual world in which hens to moorcocks call. But the memory and the meaning of their sacrifice must be enchanted and commemorated by another kind of single-mindedness. This necessity points to the subtle transformation at the core of the poem, the change embodied in the poet himself. The I, a pronoun used 4 times in the opening stanza, who twice accuses himself of speaking polite, meaningless words at the opening of this most accomplished of poems, will undergo a change as radical and utter as that attributed to the Easter rebels. In the final stanza, that voice will change from singular to plural, from individual to collective, to speak for the entire nation. Now it is our part to murmur name upon name, and we who know their dream. And thus speaking from a communitarian perspective, the speaker can at last return to individual apotheosis, finally identifying not only the specific individuals by name, but also self-identifying as the laureate of the emerging Irish nation. As he says, once again, I write it out in a verse, MacDonough and McBride and Conley and Pierce, now and in time to be. Wherever green is worn are changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. The wearers of comic motley of the first stanza, both they and I, have been transformed to wearers and a weaver of green. The regenerative color of springtime is paradoxically plated with the regenerative recitation of the poem. The elegiac tradition which Yeats responded to was itself fundamentally and irrevocably altered by Yeats's poem. Given the centrality of Easter 1916 in the Irish understanding of the emergence of its own nationalist aspiration, the poem remains something of a formidable template for anyone bold enough to take up such a subject. Unfortunately, History has a way of repeating itself in Ireland, and the 3-decade period which closed the 20th century in Ireland seems an uncanny replay of the 3 decades which opened it, at least in terms of political violence. This force field, which produced a flowering of Irish literature just as the modern Irish state came into existence, has once again generated a proliferation of drama, fiction, and poetry. And just as Yeats is the poet who memorialized and interrogated the political transformation of Ireland at the opening of this century, Seamus Heaney, raised within the minority community in Northern Ireland, is the poet most closely associated with the chronicling of the Northern Irish Troubles for the past 35 years. Heaney, born in 1939, the year of Yeats' death, by the way, is in many ways the complete antithesis of Yeats. Yeats was a Protestant born into a family with Anglo-Irish ancestry and tradition. Heaney is Catholic, born on a farm in County Derry, the oldest of 9 children. Yeats would come to valorize the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland, which he saw more and more as the aristocratic mainstay and source of Irish culture and art, even as he recorded the demise of that class historically and politically in his own lifetime. Heaney, on the other hand, places great stress on the agrarian values of what Daniel Cockery has called the hidden Ireland, the values of the peasants working close to the land. In his initial volumes of poetry, Heaney is much more concerned with life on the farm than in the Anglo-Irish big houses, seeming more like a Northern Irish Robert Frost than an inheritor of Yeats's mantle. His exemplary heroes are the local artisans, the potato digger, the blacksmith, the thatcher, each of whom provides a model and a standard for his own art. In the late 1960s, however, life changed drastically in Northern Ireland. Northern Irish civil rights group, inspired by the success of the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King in the United States, mounted a campaign of nonviolent political protest against the systematic discrimination in jobs, housing, and education, which had been directed against the minority Catholic community since the partition of the island into North and South in 1920. The protests, however, reignited long-simmering political and religious animosities and led to sectarian violence carried out by paramilitary groups such as the Irish Republican Army and the Ulster Defence Force. Civil order and public safety in Northern Ireland quickly degenerated, and in 1969, the British government suspended the Northern Ireland Parliament and instituted direct rule from London, using British Army troops to carry out this mandate. With the outbreak of the Troubles, Heaney was forced to turn his attention to politics. As a member of the Catholic minority community, he participated in many of the civil rights marches to protest the discrimination the Catholics in the North had experienced since the partition. When the demonstrations turned violent and the local constabulary could not maintain civil order, the British Army was called in to restore civil peace, an intervention which at first was welcomed by the Catholics, since it was clear that the Royal Ulster Constabulary, along with their Beast Special Auxiliaries, was part of the problem. Unfortunately, the violence escalated rather than abated, and Heaney in 1972 moved with his family from Belfast to the Republic of Ireland. In a collection published shortly after that move, Heaney wrote the first of what would be a famous sequence of bog poems, a reaction he had to a book of photographs by the Danish archaeologist P.V. Glob. Sensing a grim and deterministic analogy, Heaney placed Glob's photographs of the exhumed corpses from Iron Age sacrificial rites in Denmark next to contemporary victims of political violence in Northern Ireland. And then in North, the book of poems which came out 3 years after that, Heaney expanded this dark analogy in a sequence of poems which have proved enormously controversial. In one poem, Punishment, Heaney seems to be especially providing a rationale for the ongoing violence and its inevitability. Reacting to a photograph of a young girl presumably killed for adultery back in the Iron Age, Heaney sees an analogy between the primitive punishment meted out to the Iron Age girl and the contemporary tar and feathering of Northern Irish Catholic girls who had dated British soldiers. Addressing the Iron Age victim, Heaney acknowledges his own inaction in the face of such contemporary atrocity, but finishes with what some took as a justification for such violence. This is the last 2 stanzas of that poem. He says, "I, who stood dumb when your betraying sisters cold and tar wept by the railing, who would connive in civilized outrage, yet understand the exact and tribal, intimate revenge. For Conacruz O'Brien, Heaney's use of the word exact in this situation is the one that's most painful. As he says, the word exact fits the situation as it's felt to be, and because it fits, and because other situations among the rival population turn on similarly oiled pivots, that hope succumbs. By understanding the nature of this tribal revenge, and by diminishing or dismissing non-sectarian protest as conniving in civilized outrage, Heaney seems to take sides and implicitly to condone the violence done to the women. To be fair, it's important within the context of the poem to note Heaney's earlier sense of collective inadequacy and individual culpability in the face of such violence. But poems such as Punishment very much identify Heaney as a voice speaking from within the minority community, trying, not altogether successfully, to come to terms both morally and aesthetically with a religious, political, and cultural alliance quite distinct from that of Yeats. Despite this association, Heaney has published only one poem directly addressing what is surely one of the defining episodes of these most recent troubles, the events of Bloody Sunday. If the 1916 Easter Rising proved in retrospect the crucial catalyst in the birth of the Irish nation, Bloody Sunday marked the turning point, for the worse, unfortunately, in the long occupation of Northern Ireland by the British Army. After the events of that day and the efforts of the British government to exonerate the killings by the 1st Parachute Regiment, membership in paramilitary groups such as the IRA and the UDF soared, and what Heaney has called neighborly murder became commonplace for the next 25 years. Interestingly enough, just as Yeats's poem was initially assumed to be an unambiguous affirmation of the heroes of the Easter Rising, Heaney's Casualty initially seems to be a protest of British policy in Northern Ireland, and thus would be, politically at least, aligned with the protesting minority community against the British oppressors. But to an extent even more subtly subversive than Yeats, Heaney calls attention in his poem's title and focus not to the multiple casualties caused by the British soldiers that day, but to the single casualty killed by an IRA bomb 3 days later. The consequence of that person's ignoring a curfew declared by the IRA on its own community. The poetic form of the poem is also something of a red flag. While the three-stressed triminal line appears in a variety of Yeats's poem from his middle period, including Easter 1916, and is one, according to Helen Vendler, that Yeats favored in writing nationalist poems, the form is unusual for Heaney. In a conversation with Carl Miller, while acknowledging Yeats as a powerful presence in his writing from the 1970s on, Heaney downplays any influence that Yeats may have had acoustically and rhythmically on his poems. But he makes an exception for Casualty. He says, "You're right to say that Yeats had little to do with the sounds I've made. Here and there in field work, maybe. In Casualty, there are echoes of those short three-stressed lines of Middle Yeats, but his influence there is of an obvious, implanted sort. It's not generic." Pursuing this formal implanting, a number of commentators have called attention to its parallel with a poem of Yeats called The Fisherman, which also has that meter, noting that the protagonist in each offers a certain ideal for the speaker in each poem. But what seems even more obvious, given the occasion of significant political violence for each poem, is this poem's parallel with Easter 1916. Casualty addresses in 3 sections the situation of a fisherman acquaintance of the speaker, an alcoholic regular at the pub who refuses to obey a curfew called by the IRA in the wake of the Bloody Sunday killings. The fisherman goes off to another pub, presumably one in the Protestant community which would not obey such a curfew, and as a result, he's killed in a retaliation bombing carried out by members of his own community. The poem, in its 2nd and 3rd sections, contrasts the public and collective funeral of the civil rights protesters who were killed with the smaller funeral of the fishermen, and ends with a memory of the fishermen out eel fishing early one morning. And I'll read the poem now. But before I do, I should say in that first section of the poem, there's a couple of terms that some of you may not be familiar with. Bogside is the Catholic ghetto in the city of Derry where the shootings took place on Bloody Sunday, and Paras is short for the 1st Parachute Regiment, That's the Special Operations Combat Unit that the British government sent in to contain the peace demonstration. Casualty. He would drink by himself and raise a weathered thumb toward the high shelf, calling another rum and blackcurrant without having to raise his voice, or order a quick stout by a lifting of the eyes and a discreet dumb show of pulling off the top. At closing time would go in waders and peaked cap into the showery dark, a dull-kept breadwinner, but a natural for work. I loved his whole manner, sure-footed but too sly, his deadpan sidling tact, his fisherman's quick eye, and turned observant back. Incomprehensible to him, my other life. Sometimes, on his high stool, too busy with his knife at a tobacco plug, and not meeting my eye, he mentioned poetry. We'd be on our own, and always politic and shy of condescension. I would manage by some trick to switch the talk to eels or lore of the horse and cart or the provisionals. But my tentative art his turned back watches too. He was blown to bits out drinking in a curfew others obeyed, 3 nights after they shot dead the 13 men in Derry. Paris 13, the walls said, Bogside nil. That Wednesday, everybody held their breath and trembled. It was a day of cold, raw silence, wind-blown surplice and soutane, rained on, flower-laden coffin after coffin seemed to float from the door of the packed cathedral like blossoms on floating water. The common funeral unrolled its swaddling band, lapping, tightening, till we were braced and bound like brothers in a ring. But he would not be held at home by his own crowd, whatever threats were phoned, whatever black flags waved. I see him as he turned in that bomb-defending place, remorse fused with terror, in his still knowable face, his cornered, out-faced stare blinding in the flash. He had gone miles away, for he drank like a fish, nightly, naturally, swimming toward the lure of warm, lit-up places, the blurred mesh and murmur drifting among glasses in the gregarious smoke. How culpable was he that last night he broke our tribe's complicity? Now you're supposed to be an educated man, I hear him say. Puzzle me the right answer to that one. I missed his funeral, those quiet walkers and sideway talkers shoaling out of his lane to the respectable purring of the hearse. They move in equal pace with the habitual slow consolation of a dawdling engine, the line lifted, hand over fist, cold sunshine on the water, the land banked under fog. That morning, when he took me in his boat, the screw purling, turning indolent phantoms white, I tasted freedom with him. To get out early, haul steadily off the bottom, dispraise the catch, and smile as you find a rhythm working you, slow mile by mile, into your proper haunt, somewhere well out, beyond. Dawn-sniffing revenant, plotter through midnight rain, question me again. Like Easter 1916, the poem is a response to an act of political violence of national significance. And like Easter 1916, in commemorating those killed in that act of violence, the speaker is prompted to redefine his understanding of the function of the poet. Even more, what's striking about each poem in the trajectory of the poet's work is that each seems a tipping point of sorts in terms of their various political allegiances. For Yeats, he had to reach deep inside himself to overcome feelings of class contempt or spiritual disdain he felt for Catholic middle-class nationalists in order to valorize a broader, more collective understanding of Irish nationality, and in so doing, to validate his own credentials as poetic spokesperson for the nation. In Heaney's case, a very different sort of alignment occurs. The portrait the speaker presents in the opening section is detailed and sympathetic. This regular drinker, unlike Yeats's idealized and non-existent fisherman in that other fisherman poem, knows his way around and through the pub mores, and more than anything, attracts the speaker's attention and admiration by his subtle awareness of his environment. As he says, I loved his whole manner, sure-footed but too sly, his deadpan sidling tact, his fisherman's quick eye, and turned observant back. But the middle section of this stanza is devoted to the incomprehensible distance the poet-speaker senses between the two, between the life the two experience in the pub and what he calls my other life. Despite his admiration for this artisan, the speaker acknowledges that he manages, as he says, by some trick, which interestingly rhymes with politics, to shift the conversation to topics more familiar to the fisherman. In one respect, the speaker says he's shy of condescension. On the other hand, by tricking a shift of conversation, he's reinforcing by another form of condescension the distance he seeks to displace. What's revealing, given the events of Bloody Sunday which follow at the end of the section, is the juxtaposition established between the speaker's self-consciousness as a poet and the fisherman's more instinctive manner. So he says, but my tentative art his turned back watches too. The ambiguous syntax here, as in much of Yeats's later poetry, is intriguing. Who or what is watching whom? But my tentative art his turned back watches too. Section 2 of the poem opens with a description of the collective funeral for those killed by the British paratroopers. The poet-speaker attends, but as several commentators have pointed out, the community evoked implies constriction as much as solidarity. As he says, the common funeral unrolled its swaddling band, lapping, tightening, till we were braced and bound like brothers in a ring. Moreover, it's against this constriction that the unnamed alcoholic rebels. In refusing to abide by the curfew imposed by his own crowd, the fisherman, supported only by a cliché, he drank like a fish, is lured to the doom awaiting him at the pub violating the curfew. The question the death generates in the mind of the speaker, however, turns out to be moral and political rather than personal or emotional. He says, how culpable was he that last night when he broke our tribe's complicity? The our in that phrase collectively includes the poet-speaker and the crowd he was bound to at the funeral. The solidarity Yeats proclaims at the end of Easter 1916 with his use of the first-person plural is here the basis for moral unease rather than collective affirmation. Equally significant is the group identification as tribe, which figured so prominently at the end of that earlier poem, Punishment. In that bog poem, the speaker confesses that he would connive in civilized outrage at the abuse given to the Catholic girls who dated British soldiers, but would also understand the exact and tribal intimate revenge. While there's much in the poem to assuage the speaker's condoning of the abuse, the identification with the tribe is assumed and confirmed in that poem, if only to validate the sense of moral disequilibrium with which that poem ends. Here, however, parallel to the way the word connive was used earlier to undermine the rational but detached outrage of civilized outsiders, the speaker describes the group cohesiveness as complicity, implying a questionable or criminal collusion as opposed to a knowledgeable intimacy. The tribal bond now exacts a distinct moral cost. We discover in the final section that even though the poet-speaker did attend the collective funeral for those killed by the British Army, he does not attend the fishermen's. But the distance between the two, implied in the concern about condescension in the first section, is here overcome with the memory of an eel fishing outing the two had early one morning. Just as Heaney had in his early poems valorized artisans such as thatchers, blacksmiths, and potato diggers as exemplars of artistic integrity, he finds an extended metaphor of artistic freedom and method in the actions of the non-conforming fisherman. As he says, to get out early, to haul steadily off the bottom, dispraise the catch, and smile as you find a rhythm working you, slow mile by mile, into your proper haunt, somewhere well out beyond. The consolation or affirmation one might expect at the conclusion of an elegy is here obliquely transformed into a prompt for artistic integrity, one which places moral and individual imperatives over that of group solidarity. The fisherman, though a plotter through midnight rain, is also a dawn-sniffing revenant, that is, a returning ghostly presence. The poet-speaker had earlier given voice to the person who would find poetry incomprehensible. He said, "Now you're supposed to be an educated man," I hear him say. "Puzzle me the right answer to that one." At that point, the speaker's question concerning culpability and complicity were balanced by the fisherman's question, which was posed as a puzzle. This poet-speaker now evokes the fisherman as his muse, or perhaps more accurately, as his aesthetic gadfly. When he concludes, "Question me again," he links his own dawn-sniffing in the midnight of Irish politics to that of the outsider, the loner who refused to be held in by his own crowd. Thus, it seems that Heaney arrives at a position opposite that of Yeats at the end of Easter 1916. For Yeats, his embrace, albeit a reluctant one, of the Easter rebels provides an opportunity to declare himself poet laureate of the emerging Irish nation. For Heaney, in contrast, it compels him to resist rather than embrace cultural or political group identification. What both have in common, however, is a willingness to move beyond, to transcend earlier positions, which, given the internecine nature of Irish politics, could only perpetuate rather than alleviate the conflict. And here one hopes that Ian Paisley and Jerry Adams are paying close attention. In order to address adequately issues of national and collective significance, each had to overcome individual and personal limiting perspectives. In this sense, both poems are subtle demonstrations of Yeats's working definition of poetry, with which I'll finish. Yeats said, famously, "We make out of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves, poetry. Unlike the rhetoricians who get a confident voice from remembering the crowd they have won or may win, we sing amid our uncertainty." Thank you. I'll be very happy to field a question or two or three from the audience. There's food awaiting people down at the far end. So,
I have a question.
yes.
You talk about, your last quote was about a poet dealing with his own uncertainty, and I wonder to what extent you think that Seamus Heaney is troubled or influenced in any way by the modern face of Ireland, which, heaven knows, since the 1960s has changed so very much since Ireland joined, since the era of Southern Ireland and of course Northern Ireland automatically as part of the British Isles joined the European Economic Community, which it seems to me that face of Ireland, which we like to think about and which you referred to, the Thatchers and the ploughmen and those type of people, in fact, they've all but disappeared. And if you go to Ireland today, what you see is really a rather a commercially advanced country, which has gone from being considered a country that was a developing country in the 60s to really a highly commercially developed country. And therefore, as a poet, I imagine that he must somehow reflect that, so that maybe feeds his uncertainty.
Well, let me just say that Heaney has received a great deal of satire by other Northern Irish poets for exactly this reason. Paul Muldoon, another Northern Irish poet, seems to have spent his entire career making fun of the agrarian pieties that inform a great deal of Heaney's poetry. Actually, the thing that's interesting is that in his last book of poems, District and Circle, which came out last year, Heaney is addressing, he has a great number of poems that go back to his childhood farm, but the range which he addresses has a great deal to do with the post-9/11 world. It's very interesting. It's more global, at least in terms of political implication, than it is in terms of the Irish troubles that he was forced to deal with here. In fact, I see this particular poem as a movement away from that confrontation of Irish troubles for a while, at least into issues that had much more to do with elegiac spiritual issues, and only now seem to be coming back. But I'm not sure if I'm answering your question directly. That is to say, Heaney himself, as far as I know, I mean, there was one poem called, I think it's the Mud Person, in which he tries to address this whole strange change of heart or mind in modern Ireland. But for the most part, he focuses himself on where he started from. So, other questions? Sorry. Yeah, Joel.
The theme of tribe, of mob,
Yeah.
of both Yeats and he reacting against a kind of a collective movement of psychology. Are they unique voices in Irish poetry in that regard, or does that reflect a broader kind of sentiment in Irish poetry?
Well, I think I mean it depends pretty much on which way you want to look at it. But in Northern Irish poetry, there's been an enormous amount of resistance to being placed either in the Catholic community or the Protestant community for obvious reasons, because you're sort of marked from birth to being on one side of the divide or the other. The poet Kieran Carson, for example, seems to have spent his entire life trying to resist that, as has Paul Muldoon, and finding ways in which you could use irony to sort of step back from positions that are being imposed on you by accidents of birth. But I think, at least for someone like Heaney, who is expected very much to be a member of that minority community, who himself participated in the civil rights demonstrations, who was at St. Mary's Cathedral. He took the photograph, as it turns out, of the 13 coffins for the Derry Journal that day. The pressure that's placed on a person like that to be able to step back from the conforming urges, if you like, is enormous. Those other poets that I've mentioned have found other ways, either because they don't grow up in communities that tight, or they leave and go, as Muldoon does, to Princeton, to find ways around that. But I mean, it's interesting that you as an anthropologist asked that question, because it's precisely that when Heaney was asked to explain that term tribal, he says, I mean it in an anthropological sense. So, yeah.
I'm wondering if the difference, as a bracket of poets,
Yeah.
if it isn't the poetic urge being expressed or mirroring the actual political change of the troubles from actually its inception to what it has become in our modern times. And that being more of a mafia type of thing as opposed to a real political.
No, you're talking about the members of the IRA and the UDF involved in drug dealing and things of that sort. No, I agree. I mean, the nature of itself is very different.
For many, the actual conflict has long since lost.
Well, but what hasn't changed, and this is the difficult part, I mean, and this is at the center of, I think, both these poems and the ethos that one hopes can prevail in Northern Ireland, is that whatever the violence, it seems to ignite, or reignite, I should say, very long simmering animosities that go back to irrational, that have to do with religious, sectarian allegiances. And that's why when Heaney wrote those bog poems, the great cry was that by saying that this kind of death instinct has been around since the Iron Age, and that it's still there in the North, that's the title of that book of poems, as if there was something inevitable about it, that there was nothing that any rational, goodwill person could do. And that's why the ending of that poem brought him so much trouble. They're saying, you seem to be giving some kind of justification for this, when, if anything, we have to find some way to use our own rational, humanistic point of view to overcome those kind of atavistic feelings. So I hear what you're saying. I mean, and it's a point well taken. But there's something deeper, and one hopes that they can overcome it. Other questions? Yeah, Dan.
Another question. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this this kind of subcategory you've identified as a political elegy. It's really interesting to me that you know that both of these poems, in a way, are addressing a kind of community.
Yeah.
Right, that either the one that's about to come into being, or that is slipping away, or is somehow unsatisfactory.
Yeah.
I wonder if this has anything to do with the kind of idea of Irish nationhood that's so consistently present in a lot of 20th century literature, because the challenge especially before, before the Black and Tan War, right, is to sort of imagine a nation that has really never existed. Whether it's 32 counties completely autonomous has never actually happened. And I wonder if this national community that's being imagined in these elegiac poems, if the ambivalence of the poems toward the communities they're addressing has anything to do with the kind of tenuous or contingent quality of the nation they're trying to write into being.
Well, I mean, to sort of step back a little bit, at least in Yeats's case, that first poem that I quoted, To Ireland in the Coming Times, he very specifically links his vision to the 19th century nationalist poets, Mangan, Ferguson, and Davis, and wants very much to be of that company, as he says. He had a resistance to that kind of poetry because he thought it was too propagandistic. And that's why he wanted very much to have, if you like, not just the national, but also the personal. And I mean, in that particular poem, it becomes a bit mystic as well. But in terms of bringing into being something that doesn't exist at all, and in terms of the political parameters of a 32 county, I don't think either of these poems is really about that at all. That Yeats is not considering the way in which the Government of Ireland Act would divide Ireland into North and South in 1920. It'd be 4 years after the poem anyway. And what Heaney's after is not so much a kind of all Ireland at all, but just trying to find a way in which he can overcome constrictions of identity on the one hand, which makes him who he is, but on the other, puts him at fault somehow. So I mean, in terms of that, I mean, from another perspective, I should say, when I first began this project, I had enormous ambitions, and it was that connection between the personal and the communitarian that I wanted to look at in a whole series of Irish poets. One was Yeats, and another was Patrick Kavanagh's The Great Hunger, where Patrick McGuire's in there, and yet again John Montague in The Rough Field, and Van Bolen in her collection. That not so much in terms of a political parameter, but each one of these poets are presenting a figure that in his or her own person is somehow or another embodying both the wrongs and the aspirations of the country at large. It's not a 32 county thing, but it's much more a kind of mythic thing. Okay, so, but yes, Wendy.
I've heard different interpretations of the amazing expression that terrible beauty is born, and I'm wondering what yours is. How do you read? What is the terrible beauty?
Well, there are a number of runs on it. First of all, Maud Gonne claimed that she's the one that made it up. There have been 3 or 4 other poems that people have pointed to. I mean, what's clear is that, if nothing else, I mean, that particular paradox, that oxymoron, if you like, is bringing together the same kind of opposites that are running through the poem. And what you want to make of it, what's beautiful about it and what's terrible about it. I would think, on the one hand, it's Yeats has been accused of being a fascist because he seems to praise political violence in a poem like that. But I think if you look at it carefully, there's very little praise that is being offered in this poem at all, and a great deal of pain that's being mapped out in it. So it's I leave it oxymoronically at that. Sorry. Well, listen, thank you very much. How about heading down for something to eat?